I spent 48 hours in the most haunted forest in North America, and I barely made it out alive. They call it Ethelberg Woods. Locals call it Deadwood Mire, a place where hikers vanish, where whispers slither through the trees, and where something ancient watches from the shadows. I went in a skeptic. I came out changed. This is what happened when I dared to spend 2 nights in the Shiverwood, and why you should never go there alone. They call it Ethelberg Woods, though the locals just call it the Shiverwood, or, more bluntly, the Deadwood Mire. Online, it's a legend, consistently topping lists of the most haunted forests in North America. That title, Most Haunted, it's a magnet, isn't it? A dare. It plants a seed in your mind, a dark little kernel of expectation that begins to sprout long before you ever see the tree line. For me, a self-styled debunker with a YouTube channel slowly dying from lack of genuine scares, it was an irresistible challenge. My subscribers were baying for something real, and I, with a bravado I didn't entirely feel, was determined to give it to them, or prove, once and for all, that Ethelberg was just a spooky old forest full of overactive imaginations. The stories were certainly compelling. Decades of unexplained disappearances, hikers found wandering miles off any marked trail, their eyes vacant, babbling about impossible things. Whispers of an ancient presence, something territorial, something that fed on fear. Some said it was the spirit of a woman betrayed and murdered within its depths centuries ago. Others spoke of something older, more elemental, a consciousness woven into the very fabric of the woods. I'd read the forums, watched the grainy found footage, mostly faked, I suspected, and listened to the hushed warnings of the single, ancient attendant at the gas station closest to the forest access road. "Some places ain't meant for walking in, son," he'd rasped, his eyes like chips of mica. Especially not that one. I just smiled, paid for my gas and extra batteries, a familiar thrill mixing with a sliver of apprehension I ruthlessly suppressed. It's funny, the human mind. We tell ourselves we're rational, driven by logic, but there's always that dark, quiet corner that yearns for the abyss, that wants to peek behind the curtain of the mundane, even if what's there is monstrous. My gear was top-notch, a 4-season tent, thermal sleeping bag, enough freeze-dried food for a week, a reliable GPS, multiple cameras, including a night vision camcorder, and a hefty first aid kit. I even brought a personal locator beacon, just in case. Overkill, perhaps, but part of me, the part I didn't advertise on my channel, acknowledged the weight of the forest's reputation. The night before I drove out, I had a dream. A suffocating press of leaves against my face, the smell of damp earth filling my lungs. I woke up gasping, the echo of a silent scream caught in my throat. I dismissed it, of course. Nerves. Suggestion. The forest was already working on me, even from a distance. Day 1, the forest breathes. The edge of Ethelberg Woods wasn't marked by a welcoming sign, just a dilapidated wire fence, mostly swallowed by thorny vines, and a narrow, overgrown track that disappeared into shadow. Stepping across that threshold felt significant, like crossing into another realm where the rules of my world might not apply. The air changed instantly. The sounds of the distant highway died, absorbed by a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was watchful, expectant. The light, filtered through a canopy so dense it seemed to stitch the sky shut, was a perpetual, gloomy twilight. Ancient, gnarled oaks and pines, draped in moss that hung like tattered shrouds, loomed on all sides, their branches twisted into grotesque shapes that seemed to lean in, listening. The air was heavy, cool, and carried a loamy, almost metallic scent that pricked at the back of my throat. I hiked for a couple of hours, pushing deeper than I'd initially planned, looking for a suitable clearing. The forest floor was a thick carpet of decaying leaves that muffled my footsteps, adding to the unnerving quiet. It was the lack of normal woodland sounds that first got to me. No bird song, No chattering squirrels, not even the drone of insects. It was as if all life, save the ancient trees, held its breath. This profound stillness, where one would expect a symphony of natural sounds, was more unsettling than any shriek could have been. It hinted at an unnatural suppression, a dominant presence that commanded quiet. I finally found a small, relatively flat area, a slight depression surrounded by a tight ring of younger, thinner trees that seemed to almost shy away from the older giants. Setting up camp, the familiar routine of unfolding the tent, inflating the sleeping pad, arranging my supplies, felt like a small act of defiance against the encroaching gloom. But even these mundane actions were tinged with a growing unease. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was a classic symptom of isolation, I told myself, the brain playing tricks. Yet, the prickling sensation on the back of my neck was persistent, almost physical. As the afternoon bled into a deeper, more ominous dusk, the subtle disturbances began. A twig snapped sharply to my left, just beyond my peripheral vision. I spun around, heart thumping. Nothing. No wind stirred the leaves. Later, a rustling in the undergrowth, too deliberate, too rhythmic for a small animal. It stopped the moment I shone my flashlight in its direction. I found a patch of ground near a gnarled root that was inexplicably cold, the air chilling my skin despite the mild temperature elsewhere. My initial bravado was starting to fray at the edges, replaced by a hyper-alertness that was exhausting. The forest was transforming as the light failed, shadows stretching like grasping claws, the familiar shapes of trees resolving into monstrous silhouettes. This transition from the known of daylight to the obscurity of night, in this place already so detached from the ordinary world, amplified my vulnerability, making me acutely sensitive to the forest's perceived sentience. It felt like it was breathing, slowly, deeply, around me. Night 1. Whispers and shadows. I built a small fire, its flickering light, a fragile bastion against the immense, pressing darkness. Beyond its reach, the woods were an impenetrable wall of black. The fire, paradoxically, became a source of both comfort and unease. While its warmth was welcome, the way the flames made the shadows dance and writhe at the edge of the light was deeply unsettling. Twisted branches became skeletal arms, clumps of moss transformed into leering faces, each flicker a new, fleeting horror for my already primed imagination. Then came the whispers. At first, I dismissed it as the wind sighing through the high canopy, or the rustle of dry leaves. But as the night deepened, the sounds became more distinct, more insidious. They seemed to ride on the currents of the still air, too faint to be words, yet too patterned to be random. It was like listening to a conversation in the next room, muffled and indistinct, but undeniably there. My attempts to rationalize it, auditory pareidolia, the brain's tendency to find patterns in noise, felt increasingly hollow. The oppressive atmosphere, the profound isolation, the weight of the forest's reputation, it was all conspiring to strip away my skepticism. The feeling of being watched intensified into a palpable pressure, as if unseen eyes were boring into my back. Every snap of a twig, every creak of a branch under its own weight, sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I found myself holding my breath, straining to identify each sound, my senses stretched to their breaking point. Sleep, when it finally came, was a tormented, shallow affair. I drift off, only to be ripped awake by vivid nightmares that bled seamlessly into the unsettling reality of the forest. In one, the trees themselves were whispering my name, their voices dry and rustling. I woke with a gasp, convinced something had been scratching at the tent fabric, its presence a cold weight just inches away. In the gray, uncertain light of pre-dawn, I found something that chilled me more than the night sounds. 3 small, smooth stones, arranged in a perfect triangle on the ground just outside my tent door. They hadn't been there when I zipped myself in. It was a small thing, something that could perhaps be explained away, an animal, a peculiar settling of the earth. But in the context of everything else, it felt deliberate, a sign, a marker. The forest wasn't just a passive, spooky backdrop, it was interacting with me. My rational defenses were crumbling, eroded by the darkness, the solitude, and the constant, ambiguous threats that forced my mind to fill in the blanks with increasingly terrifying possibilities. Day 2. The point of no return. Dawn did little to dispel the oppressive atmosphere. If anything, the forest felt heavier, the silence more charged, the unseen presence more pronounced. The subtle disturbances of the previous day now felt like a gentle probing, a prelude to something more direct. Sleep deprivation and the gnawing anxiety had sharpened my senses to an almost painful degree, but also clouded my judgment. I decided to do a wider sweep of the area, partly to document for the channel, partly to try and shake off the claustrophobia. That's when I found it. About 100 yards from my camp, tucked into a dense thicket of thorns, was an effigy. It was crudely constructed from stripped branches lashed together with what looked like dried sinew, adorned with clumps of matted animal fur and what I prayed were bird bones. It stood about 3 feet tall, vaguely humanoid in shape, with a single, dark stone set where an eye should be. It wasn't ancient. It was fresh. The wood was still pale where it had been snapped. The sight of it sent a wave of nausea through me. This wasn't folklore, this was a tangible, deliberate act of malice, a clear warning. My unease turned into a cold, creeping dread. I tried to use my GPS to mark the location, but the screen was frozen, displaying only a garbled mess of pixels. My compass, when I dug it out, spun erratically, the needle quivering as if caught in a magnetic storm. I tried to backtrack to my camp, following what I thought was the way I'd come, but the trees seemed to shift, familiar landmarks vanishing, new, disorienting thickets appearing where there had been clearings. The sun, a pale disk obscured by the relentless canopy, offered no reliable direction. It was no longer a case of being simply lost. It felt as though the forest itself was actively working against me, twisting its paths, sealing me in. The subtle feeling of the forest breathing had transformed into the terrifying certainty of an active, hostile intelligence. This was the point of no return, not just geographically, but psychologically. I was no longer an observer, I was prey. The discovery of the effigy, the clear evidence of some ritualistic, malevolent presence, resonated with the darker tales of Ethelberg. It wasn't just my own fear I was feeling now, it was the accumulated terror of those who had come before, those who had perhaps seen similar signs before they vanished or were found broken. The tattered piece of faded blue fabric I found, snagged on a thorn bush a little later, clearly part of a shirt or jacket, and undeniably human, cemented this awful connection. The forest wasn't just haunted, it was a place that consumed, and I was now deep within its gullet. The realization that I would have to endure another night, deeper in, more vulnerable, with failing equipment and dwindling resolve, filled me with a despair so profound it was almost paralyzing. Night 2. The unveiling. And this happened. Exhaustion was a lead weight in my limbs, fear a cold serpent coiling in my stomach. I managed to build a pathetic fire, its flames sputtering weakly, offering little comfort against the encroaching totality of the night. I huddled in my tent, zipping it tight, the thin nylon feeling like scant protection against whatever lurked outside. The sounds began almost immediately, no longer the subtle whispers and rustles of the previous night. These were guttural, wet sounds, like something heavy dragging itself through the undergrowth. A low growl, too deep, too resonant for any known animal in these parts, vibrated through the ground. Then, a rhythmic, almost hypnotic tapping started, seeming to come from all directions at once, then focusing on the tree directly behind my tent. Tap, 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 closer. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I fumbled for my largest flashlight, its beam cutting a shaky swath through the interior of the tent. The tapping stopped. Silence descended again, but this was different. A taut, predatory silence, pregnant with imminent violence. Then the tent fabric bulged inwards, right beside my head, as if something immensely heavy had leaned against it. I scrambled back, a choked cry dying in my throat. The bulge remained for a heart-stopping moment, then slowly retracted. I could hear breathing outside, a ragged, wheezing sound, accompanied by a faint, sickly sweet odor that seeped through the tent fabric, like rotting meat and damp earth. My mind, already frayed, teetered on the edge of collapse. The question of whether this was real or a product of my terror-stricken imagination was utterly irrelevant. This was my reality, absolute and all-consuming. This was the unveiling, the moment the forest, or whatever dwelled within it, decided to show its hand. It was a violation of everything I understood about the world, a shattering of the thin veneer of normalcy that kept the deeper primal terrors at bay. A shadow fell over the tent, impossibly large, blotting out the faint starlight that filtered through the canopy. And then, a sound that will haunt me until the day I die. My name, spoken in a voice that was a grotesque parody of human speech, a chorus of dry whispers and wet clicks, as if spoken by a legion of insects. It came from directly above me. I don't know what broke in me then. Primal terror, the fight-or-flight instinct kicking in with the force of a physical blow. I ripped open the tent zipper, a wild, incoherent scream tearing from my lungs, and burst out into the oppressive darkness. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran. Blindly, stupidly, crashing through unseen branches that tore at my skin and clothes, stumbling over roots, my lungs burning, the sounds of pursuit, a heavy, rapid thudding, the snapping of undergrowth, that awful, chittering voice calling my name, echoing in the suffocating darkness behind me. I didn't care about direction, only distance. The forest was a black, suffocating labyrinth, every tree a grasping monster, every shadow a new threat. The escape and the scar, hours, seemed to pass in that desperate, adrenaline-fueled flight. My legs were leaden, my breath came in ragged, painful gasps. Just as I felt I could run no further, that I would collapse and be consumed by the pursuing horror, I saw it, a faint, diffuse glow through the trees. Hope, a forgotten sensation, surged through me. I stumbled towards it, bursting through a final curtain of tangled vines and onto the blessed, solid asphalt of a deserted country road. I collapsed onto the rough surface, sobbing, gasping, my body trembling uncontrollably. The pre-dawn air was cold, but it felt clean, pure, untainted by the malevolent breath of Ethelberg woods. I lay there for a long time, staring up at the first pale streaks of dawn painting the sky, the sounds of the forest, or what I imagined were the sounds of the forest, still echoing in my ears. When a farmer in a rattling pickup truck found me hours later, I was a wreck, disheveled, covered in scratches and bruises, my clothes torn, my eyes wide and haunted. I tried to tell him what happened, but the words came out as a jumbled, incoherent babble. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and suspicion, eventually driving me to the nearest small town and leaving me at the sheriff's office. They listened, of course, with that patient, skeptical air that authorities reserve for the unhinged. Lost hiker, exposure, stress-induced hallucination. That was the official verdict. My expensive camera gear, left behind in my panicked flight, was never recovered. There was no evidence of my effigy, no sign of whatever had terrorized me. The forest kept its secrets. The escape from Ethelberg wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a different kind of haunting. The nightmares are relentless, vivid replays of that final, terrifying night. I can't stand to be near wooded areas, especially at dusk. The silence of a quiet room can become oppressive, filled with imagined whispers. I have a scar, a thin, jagged line on my forearm from a branch that nearly took my eye out during my flight, but the deeper scars are the ones no one can see. The worst part, perhaps, is the incommunicability of it all. How do you explain to someone that the world they know, the solid, rational world has a gaping wound in it, a place where impossible things claw their way into reality. You can't. And so, you bear it alone, the experience an isolating brand. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is still and dark, I'll catch a faint scent on the air, damp earth and something else, something sickly sweet. And I know, with a certainty that chills me to the bone, that Ethelberg Woods isn't just a place on a map. A part of it came back with me. Or perhaps, a part of me never truly left. The boundary between that haunted place and my own home has become terrifyingly permeable. The forest marked me, and its shadows stretch very, very far.
Story 1. The Whispering Corpse. The silence of the Stillwater National Forest was supposed to be a balm. That's what I'd told myself anyway as I'd packed the car, ignoring the pitying glances from well-meaning friends. Grief is a loud companion, and after Liam's sudden departure from this world, the cacophony of condolences and shared memories had become unbearable. I needed a quiet place, a space to simply be with the ragged hole he'd left in my life. I'd hiked often, but this was my first solo camping trip. Alara, the self-reliant widow, I'd thought with a grimace. The forest, at least, wouldn't offer platitudes. The drive was long, the last hour on a gravel road that dwindled to a rutted track. Stillwater wasn't a popular spot, known more for its unsettling local tales than its scenic trails, tales I'd dismissed as rural folklore. I found a small, secluded copse, a little clearing cupped by ancient gnarled oaks, and a dense undergrowth of ferns that seemed to swallow the light. It felt contained. Perfect! Setting up the tent, rolling out my sleeping bag, preparing a simple meal of soup and bread, these were rituals, anchors of control in a life that had spun wildly off course. The air was still unnervingly so. No birdsong trilled from the dense canopy above, just the occasional, distant caw of a crow that sounded more like a warning. As dusk began to bleed through the trees, tinting the world in shades of bruised purple and gray, I noticed the ground within the copse was strangely barren, the earth packed hard as if nothing had grown here for a very long time. Near the edge of the clearing, a small, unnatural pile of smooth gray stones caught my eye, arranged in a spiral that made the hairs on my arms prickle. I told myself it was just some previous camper's handiwork, a fleeting landmark. The wind, when it finally sighed through the leaves, seemed to carry sounds that hovered on the edge of intelligibility, like snatches of conversation too faint to grasp. Fatigue, I reasoned. Grief plays tricks on the mind. The solitude I craved began to feel less like a comfort and more like a stark, echoing void as true night descended. The darkness here was absolute, a thick, viscous black that pressed in from all sides, swallowing the feeble glow of my headlamp beyond a few feet. The familiar forest sounds I'd anticipated, the chirping of crickets, the hoot of an owl, were absent. Instead, there was only the rustle of leaves, magnified in the silence until it sounded like furtive, dragging footsteps just beyond my tent. A twig snapped nearby, sharp and sudden, and my heart leaped into my throat. An animal, I told myself, just a deer or a raccoon. But the silence that followed was heavier, more watchful. Then, the whispers started. At first, they were indistinguishable from the sigh of the wind in the oak leaves. A sibilant, breathy murmur. I strained my ears, my breath catching. Just the wind, I repeated, a mantra against the rising tide of unease. My anxiety, usually a low hum I could manage, began to sharpen, to keen. The forest, this place I'd chosen for solace, was beginning to feel like a trap. The whispers grew, not in volume, but in clarity, coalescing from the rustling leaves, the creak of branches, the very air itself. They weren't in any language I recognized, yet they felt deeply, horribly personal. My grief, a raw and gaping wound, felt exposed here, almost as if the forest could sense it, taste it. The whispers seemed to coil around it, to probe its depths. I zipped the tent flap shut, a flimsy barrier against the immense, listening dark. The cold seeped in anyway, a damp, bone-chilling cold that had little to do with the night air. My small campfire, which I'd carefully built, sputtered and died with a final, defeated hiss, though the wood was dry and plentiful. I fumbled for my flashlight, its beam cutting a nervous swath through the interior of the tent. My water bottle, which I'd placed beside my sleeping bag, was now near the tent's entrance, several feet away. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me more than the air, that I hadn't put it there. The whispers intensified, closer now, as if the trees themselves were leaning in, their ancient, woody throats forming these insidious sounds. And then, a new horror. A voice. Liam's voice, woven into the sibilant chorus. "Alara, why did you leave me?" A sob tore from my throat. It couldn't be. It was the grief, the isolation, my mind fracturing under the strain. But the voice was so clear, so infused with his unique timbre, his gentle reproach. The forest wasn't just haunted, it was a sentient, malevolent psychologist, excavating my deepest sorrows and twisting them into instruments of torture. I scrambled out of the tent, desperate to escape the voice, the oppressive atmosphere of the copse. My headlamp beam danced wildly, catching glimpses of inhuman faces that seemed to flicker between the gnarled tree trunks, eyes that gleamed with a cold, ancient light before vanishing. The small clearing, which had felt compact by day, now seemed a disorienting labyrinth. I tried to find the faint path I'd taken in, but the trees seemed to have shifted, their branches tangling like grasping claws, the familiar landmarks gone. Every direction I turned led me back towards the silent, accusing stones of the spiral. Panic, cold, and absolute flooded me. My blood roared in my ears, each crunch of leaves under my boots a thunderclap. I was being toyed with, herded. The whispers were inside my head now, a cacophony of sorrow and accusation, Liam's voice prominent among them, morphing from gentle sorrow to a chilling, hungry demand. I screamed, a raw, ragged sound swallowed by the indifferent trees. I stumbled, fell, and curled into a ball on the cold, barren earth, pressing my hands over my ears, but the voices were inside me now, or perhaps I was inside them. The line between my mind and the forest had dissolved. Dawn arrived not as a gentle reprieve, but as a slow, gray dilution of the terror. The whispers faded with the darkness, leaving behind an exhausted, ringing silence. I was lying at the edge of the copse, my clothes torn, my skin scratched and icy. The spiral of stones looked ordinary, almost mundane in the pale light. The trees stood silent, impassive. A park ranger found me later that morning, drawn by the sight of my abandoned car. I remember his concerned face, the careful way he spoke to me. I tried to tell him about the whispers, about Liam's voice, about the trees that moved and watched, but the words came out as a jumbled, nonsensical babble. He just nodded, his eyes full of a pity that was different from the kind I'd fled, a pity reserved for those whose minds have touched something they cannot unsee. They said I was suffering from exposure and acute stress, a grief-induced psychotic break. Perhaps they were right. I have no physical scars to prove otherwise, beyond a few scratches. But I know what I heard. I know what I felt. The Stillwater National Forest keeps its secrets, and it left its mark on me, an indelible scar of ambiguity. I no longer seek solace in silence, for silence now holds the echo of whispers. And I can never look at a tree the same way again, without a shiver of dread, wondering what ancient listening consciousness might reside within its heartwood.
Story 2. The Hunger in Blackwood Creek. I've always had a taste for the fringe, the places where maps get vague and stories get wild. Call it a hobby, call it an obsession. I'm an amateur cryptozoologist, a folklore chaser. When I heard the whispers about Blackwood Creek Forest, a place supposedly patrolled by something old and hungry, something that left more than just deer carcasses in its wake, my interest wasn't just piqued, it was hooked. Locals spun yarns about a creature, a Blackwood brute, some kind of Wendigo-esque entity, they said, that had been part of the forest's grim reputation for generations. Disappearances, unsettling sounds, the whole 9 yards. Perfect. My plan was simple. A weekend solo camp, deep in the forest gut, armed with my usual gear, plus a few trail cams and high-sensitivity audio recorders. If there was something out there, I wanted evidence. If not, well, a challenging camp in an ancient, reputedly impenetrable forest was its own reward. The edge of Blackwood Creek was marked by a dilapidated sign, riddled with buckshot, warning against entry. A grizzled old-timer at the last gas station, All watery eyes and dire pronouncements had tried to wave me off. Some things in them woods best left alone. Son, that forest, it don't like being poked. I'd offered a polite smile and an internal eye roll. Hubris, I suppose, is a comfortable cloak until it's ripped from your back. I pushed a good 5 miles in, the forest growing darker, the trees thicker, their upper branches knitting together to form a perpetual twilight. I found a small clearing near the creek itself, its waters running dark and sluggish. My campsite was tactical. Tent positioned for a good view, trail cam strategically placed, audio recorder set to capture the night's symphony or its solos. The first evening was uneventful, filled with the usual forest chorus, the hoot of an owl, the distant yip of a coyote, the ceaseless thrum of insects. I felt the familiar thrill of anticipation, the hunter's edge. The first sign that I might have underestimated Blackwood Creek came at dawn. One of my trail cams, the one nearest the creek, was gone. Not fallen, not animal knocked, gone. The strap was snapped cleanly. The ground beneath showed no signs of a struggle, just a single, impossibly large, 3-toed print pressed deep into the soft earth, a print that defied any known local fauna. Later, scouting the perimeter, I found them. Deep, vicious claw marks gouged into the trunk of a massive pine at least 10 feet off the ground. The forest fell into an unnerving silence then, a complete cessation of sound that felt more threatening than any noise. That night, the hunt began, though I didn't fully grasp it at first. I, Mark the investigator, the seeker of the unknown, was becoming the investigated, the sought. The audio recorder picked it up first, a low, guttural growl that vibrated with a power that made the small hairs on my neck stand on end, a sound that seemed to circle the campsite, always just beyond the firelight's reach. My remaining trail cam, when I checked it with trembling hands the next morning, showed only a split second of a massive, dark shape blurring past the lens before the footage corrupted into static. My confidence, so robust a day before, began to fray. This wasn't some shy cryptid I could document from a safe distance. This was something else, something territorial, something intelligent. The forest itself seemed to collude with my unseen stalker. Paths I'd mentally mapped seemed to twist and turn back on themselves. An unnatural, clammy fog rolled in one afternoon, thick and disorienting, reducing visibility to mere feet, and with it came a charnel scent, like old blood and damp earth. It felt as if the entity was operating by some ancient, unspoken rules of its domain, rules I had unknowingly, arrogantly, violated simply by being there, by seeking it. The warnings weren't folklore, they were terms of engagement. Sleep became a forgotten luxury. Every snap of a twig was its approach, every rustle of leaves its patient observation. On the third night, it left a gift. A freshly killed deer, its throat torn out, laid neatly a dozen yards from my tent. Not dragged, but placed. A statement. My bravado was long gone, replaced by a primal, gnawing fear. I was prey. The climax came with a suddenness that was both shocking and inevitable. I was trying to pack, to flee, the pre-dawn gloom heavy and suffocating. A sound, a heavy thud, from the dense trees to my left made me spin around, and there it was. It was no mere beast. Towering at least 8 feet, it was a grotesque parody of the human form, yet utterly alien. Its limbs were too long, its skin the color of wet bark, matted with what looked like dried leaves and dark fur. Antlers, thick and branching like deadwood, crowned a head that was more snout than face, from which 2 eyes, small and red as embers, burned with a cold, ancient malice. It wasn't a Wendigo from the storybooks, not exactly, but it radiated the same primeval hunger, the same chilling indifference to human life. It moved with a speed that belied its bulk, a fluid, terrifying grace. I ran. My survival skills, honed over years, kicked in. I dodged, I weaved, I pushed through the undergrowth, the creature's guttural roars echoing behind me, shaking the very leaves on the trees. The forest, my enemy now, seemed to guide it, its branches snatching at my clothes, its roots tripping my feet. It herded me, I realized, towards the creek, towards a grove of particularly ancient, gnarled oaks that felt older than the forest itself, their branches like skeletal arms reaching for the bruised sky. There, by the dark, sluggish water, it cornered me. I raised my heavy camp axe, my only weapon, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Its roar was deafening, a blast of fetid air and raw power. My axe felt like a toothpick against its charge. My last clear memory is of those burning red eyes, the stench of damp earth and something else, something like decay and ancient hunger, and an overwhelming sense of an immense primordial power that had existed in these woods long before humans ever dared to name it. They found my campsite a month later, or what was left of it, my tent shredded, my gear scattered. The audio recorder held only a few seconds of distorted roaring and my own terrified screams before abruptly cutting out. Of me, there was no trace. Blackwood Creek Forest keeps its secrets well, and it always feeds its hunger. The forest is an ancient power, indifferent to our brief lives, and some territories are best left undisturbed, their legends uninvestigated. Some things are not meant to be found.